Hello, everybody, and welcome back to this series of interviews that I, John McGuirk, am conducting on Gript Media ahead of the European elections, which are now being held, I can finally say, this Friday. We're less than a week away. So when this is going out, there will be just a few days left for you to make up your mind. And to that end, we are getting towards the end and the last of these interviews. I think there'll be one more after this. But today I wanted to talk to somebody who's running a kind of a unique campaign. She is a barrister, very eminent senior counsel, had a very, very successful and glittering legal career, and she's now decided to run for the European Parliament. Although I think, Una McGuirk, it's fair to say that your campaign is it's underfunded compared to some of your opponents. So I don't know how many people will have heard of you, but you're running. So tell us a little bit about yourself. There are 23 candidates in Ireland South where you're running. Why should people pick you and not somebody else?
Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction, John. And it's lovely to be here and to have this opportunity to speak with you. And I'm very grateful. Thank you very much. So why should people vote for me? That's a good question. And indeed, the most important question, because I have a lot of experience as a barrister and as a senior counsel. As you know, and as all of your listeners and subscribers will know, almost 70% of our laws now emanate from the EU, as do many of our policies and agendas. So I think it's useful, very useful, to have somebody who has legal experience as an MEP, someone who understands the legislation. I'm not saying, of course, that everybody who runs has to be a barrister or have legal experience. Of course they don't, but I do think it helps in my case for sure.
So, I mean, I look at your campaign. I mean, I should say Michael McNamara, I think, is also a barrister, though I think he was a junior counsel.
Yes, he is indeed.
He didn't quite reach your exalted heights.
He is a senior counsel. He is indeed.
Oh, is he? Well, then my apologies to Michael.
I think so.
Yes, my apologies to Michael.
Yes.
I thought he was only a junior counsel. Shows what I know. But there are a lot of candidates running. I watched your launch video, and there are a lot of candidates running sort of on very similar themes to yours. So you talk a lot about immigration. You talk about the Nature Restoration Act. You talk about this theme of democracy in Europe. It's a very crowded field, though. And I mean, I think one of the big frustrations we're getting back from people in this campaign is like there's so many people running in the one lane. Are you not all going to split the vote? I mean, is that not a concern? So, I mean, are you involved in any kind of transfer pacts with other candidates or anything like that?
No, I can tell you actually that I'm not. And of course, it's a crowded lane, absolutely. And it is because many of the candidates running are independents. But that's not a reason not to run, and for me, that wasn't a reason. And you mentioned that it was an underfunded campaign. And I said, oh gosh, everybody obviously knows this. I was trying to keep it quiet. But now that the cat is out of the bag, we might as well come clean and say, yes, it's definitely underfunded. And I'm just relying on a few volunteers to help me, and bless them, all the people who are helping me. But I think if
well, just to be clear, I didn't mean that as any kind of slight. What I mean is that obviously the major party candidates
take it as such.
The people in Fine Gael are spending hundreds of thousands of euros on their campaign. That is just a matter of fact, and it's almost impossible for anybody.
No, absolutely. Now, goodness me, John, I didn't take it as a slight. I can assure you. I mean, in fact, it's absolutely true. And it's very difficult for somebody like me who's running as an independent, because you are competing with people who are members of large established parties, and they have funding and resources behind them that I simply don't do. And indeed, people suggested that I shouldn't run for that very reason. They said, you have no chance, you have no hope, for goodness sake, without backing, without resources, don't do it. And then I thought about it and I said, no, I feel I've got to do this because so many of the issues that I knew would be issues in the campaign are so important to me, and I would have been speaking out about them anyway. I was doing videos, these issues, the EU and Migration Pact, the WHO, pandemic treaty, hate speech laws. All of these issues, which are so relevant to the current campaign, are issues that I feel very passionate about. And I just thought, I'm going to do it anyway. We'll see what happens. And to my great surprise, so many wonderful people have just come out of nowhere, people that I never met before, I didn't even know they existed, offering me help, and it's on a very basic level. It's handing out flyers or promoting my videos on social media or on Facebook or whatever. But I'm so grateful for all of that. And I feel that I have this beautiful community behind me all the way that is rooting for me. Now, as to how many is in that community, I can't tell you at this point. I simply don't know. And I guess we will find out soon enough,
We will.
just how many is in that community.
Well, I want this interview to be about the issues that you're running on. But before we get into them, I have one question which I've asked every candidate, so it won't be a surprise, which is obviously you're running as an independent, but that is of limited utility in the European Parliament. You're going to have to find allies and people to work with. There are 7 groups at present. There may be more than that after the next election. But of the 7 groups that are currently there, where are you looking in terms of who to align with in the Parliament?
I haven't even considered that, John. I'll be honest. That's something that comes later. I have to get in there first. And when I do, I'll sit down and I will make my mind up at that stage. Also, even though there are 7 existing groups at the moment, I think it's very likely there may be a change of the type of candidate running, and who knows, there may be new groups. So that's why I did not want to limit myself to any of the groups that are currently existing, because I could find that there are other MEPs that I am aligned with, and we may have a new group. So I wanted to leave myself open to that.
All right. Let's get into the issues, because the first time I ever heard of your name was when somebody asked me, because my name is John McGuirk, your name is Una McGuirk. We are, for absolute clarity, not related in any way, shape or form. But the first time I heard of you was somebody asking if we were related, because they saw a statement that you made during the COVID pandemic. And I think it's fair to say, Una, the COVID pandemic for you was kind of, was that a really important moment in your sort of development of political awareness? Because I don't think you were very politically active before that. And how has that influenced your thinking and your decision to run and get involved in the kind of activism you're now involved in?
Yeah, no, you're right. I wasn't very politically active, as in being openly political active, but I was a very aware person. And when COVID hit, like a lot of other people, I felt there was significant government overreach. I had certain strong views about that. And as you know, I spoke at a rally in Dublin in August of 2020 on behalf of Health Freedom Ireland. And I was asked to speak about the issues of masks. And I had researched that topic. I mean, I have a background in medical negligence. I'm a qualified holistic dietitian. I have lots of qualifications in those types of areas. So I know a lot about that. I know a lot about medicine, maybe from a different perspective, not maybe from a pharmacological point of view, but I had a view about the wearing of masks, and I spoke at that rally. And I think you know as well as I do what happened then. It resulted really in my being cancelled by the political establishment and censored by mainstream media. Obviously,
when you say cancelled, can you spell out what happened to you? Because I think you were sitting on the Refugee Appeals Tribunal and various other positions. You lost a number of those appointments, didn't you?
I did indeed. Well, basically, a number of government ministers started tweeting about me openly and publicly the next day and calling for inquiries regarding my behaviour. And I felt that was very unsavoury. And then that ultimately led to my not being reappointed by the minister. I was on the International Protection Appeals Tribunal. I was an adjudicator there. It's a quasi-judicial contractual position. I'm not a judge or anything like that. But I wasn't renewed because there seemed to have been a very significant campaign or backlash against me by a lot of social media groups all over the place, which I found to be quite extraordinary, John, because I didn't know these people. I didn't know them from Adam, and suddenly they were very mysteriously motivated to attack me quite viciously on social media. And this absolutely shocked me, because I wasn't really someone that was very much on social media. You can imagine some people of my age tend not to be. And so this shocked me, that complete strangers would want to vilify me and defame me. And they had never even met me, and they knew nothing about me. They knew nothing about my views. They knew nothing about my history. I'd spent my entire life as a lawyer engaged in the pursuit of justice. I mean, I'm a humanitarian to my core. I've worked at the UN helping Kashmiris. You know, I'm a former chairperson, national chairperson of the Irish Red Cross Society. I was the youngest in the world at the time. So many good things I feel for people, because my heart is in the right place. As I said, I'm a natural humanitarian, and these people came out very strongly against me, but it affected my other position as well. It's kind of a long story, but ultimately it was clear to me really that the establishment did not want me out there. And that's how I feel I got cancelled. And then practically most of the media, with the exception of your good self, wrote these dreadful articles about me, nefarious articles, calling me a conspiracy theorist and all sorts of things. So again, it wasn't very nice. And as I said, a lot of groups on social media targeted me as well. And so the whole thing really was that I was cancelled and censored by the media. In addition, as well as the two ministers coming out strongly against me, all the spokespersons of all the main political parties, from memory, they issued statements condemning what I said. Now, what is extraordinary about what I said, John, and I spoke essentially about two things. One was the wearing of masks. I was concerned about it being mandatory. Of course, if people want to wear a mask as a choice, I fully respect that. And many people did, and including many of my friends wore masks because it made them feel safe. And of course I would support that. My concern was the mandatory wearing of masks, especially for children. And I've proven to be correct. I mean, the Cochrane study has shown that it made absolutely no difference. Not only did it make any difference to the virus, actually caused health problems for a lot of people, including, they say, with children. There's evidence that it could have affected their cognitive development. Again, the other thing I spoke out about was the PCR test, and I said it was a flawed test that should never have been used in isolation. And again, I've been proven to be correct about that. So the two things I spoke about, I've been proven to be correct about them. Not that anybody has said that publicly, of course, but that is the situation. But I ended up effectively losing my two positions. And, that was really the cancellation. And nobody in mainstream media has touched me ever since. And in fact, throughout this campaign, I haven't been interviewed by RTE or any news talk or any of the mainstream media people. And so it is a credit to you, John, that in Gript that you have chosen to do that. So fair play to you. I'm delighted, as indeed are all of my supporters.
Well, just on the mask, I'm always fascinated with this business about masks. And people seem to have forgotten that at the very beginning of the pandemic, for about the first 3 months or so, people were actually told not to wear masks, that they were useless, that they made no difference, which was transparently about the fact that the government hadn't sufficient supplies of them. So they were telling people not to wear them. And then all of a sudden, one afternoon, it flipped on a lid and they became mandatory. So,
You're absolutely right. And thank you for reminding me and everybody about that. And there was no justification for that flip. So again, I saw that as being a very serious aspect of this government overreach, which was ultimately about control. And I knew that, as did many others. I'm not the only one who knew it, but I came out and said it publicly, and it just didn't go down well. And that's putting it mildly.
Now, let's talk about something you've been very vocal about, which is the COVID pandemic treaty that is going on. Because I have to say, this is an area I get more emails probably on this topic than just about any other. And I have to say, Una, I'm a bit of a skeptic. I'm a bit of a skeptic of all the panic, and maybe you can set me right, because I look at this and I see this treaty has very little chance of passing, because it's making demands of countries that I mean, we've just seen in the recent weeks, the UK, for example, saying it wouldn't sign it because of the demands being placed on it, that it would have to export potential future vaccines for future pandemics rather than provide them to his own people. I mean, what are the exact provisions in that treaty that you find very problematic, and what can you do as an MEP to bring about change?
Well, first of all, as you know, there has been no agreement on the treaty in the first place.
Yes, correct.
And I think they're not really going to get any agreement on it. But it's this idea of the one world health concept, and that the WHO as an organization will have so much significant that in a moment. But if you read through the treaty, you will see that in many respects, it's almost more like a trade agreement, which is in many respects what it is, because they use language like pathogens with pandemic potential. I mean, what kind of organization that is supposed to be concerned about people's health will be concerned about pathogens with pandemic potential. Now, what we're talking about here when they use the phrase with pandemic potential is with financial pandemic potential. As in, if you're a country and you're a member of the WHO and you find a pathogen, please let us out it as quickly as possible. We'll get it to our pharmaceutical companies and they'll make a vaccine or an inoculation based on that. And then WHO will get a certain percentage and you as a country will get percentage, and you can actually make money out of this, and we can set up all these labs all over the world. And what emerges from reading it, if you've read it, is this sense of, my goodness, they're like setting us up. It's almost like they're setting us up for another pandemic, and they're preparing for it, and they're preparing for it also in a financial sense about what happens. Now, we want to make sure that if there's a pathogen out there that we won't let it go to waste. We'll have to just get it into the lab and get a vaccine made as quickly as possible so that, we can all make money out of it. It's just slightly unsavory. I mean, the other issue I have with the pandemic treaty as such, and indeed the whole involvement of the world, essentially two things. One, I have a concern that this organisation has never carried out a proper inquiry to investigate the origins of COVID. We all know the damage that COVID caused. I don't know if we'll ever be able to estimate the effect it's had on our lives, both emotionally, financially, in terms of mental health, loss of jobs, loss of businesses. I mean, it's just been phenomenal. So it was a very difficult and traumatic time, I think, for every single human being in the world. Wouldn't you agree? And here we have an organisation that purports to be concerned about the health of people, and they've never carried out any investigation with regard to the origins of that. And yet they are preparing us for another pandemic. So my view, and the view of many people, I think, with regard to this treaty, is that before you start paving the way and setting up circumstances for the next pandemic, let's find out how and why the first one happened. And then the second issue that I have with the WHO is with regard to the Director General himself, a man whom has been entertained on a number of occasions by our government, including our president. And this man is wanted on very serious charges, of crimes against humanity in relation to his own people in Ethiopia when he was the Foreign Affairs Minister and the Health Minister.
Well, I don't want to get into that because he's not here to defend himself, in fairness. But
that's fair enough. It's fair enough. I'm only saying it because it's a concern I have. You ask me.
I will say on the pandemic treaty. I mean, I think there are issues with the pandemic treaty. I mean, I look at Article 8.3, which says the parties shall, on building existing tools, develop and implement an inclusive, transparent, effective and efficient pandemic prevention, preparedness and response monitoring and evaluation system. So that basically is committing us to develop and implement a system, but doesn't ever tell us what that system is. So I think there are concerns about, the vagueness of much of the language. For example, Article 5.4 reads that we shall improve infection and prevention and control measures, antimicrobial research and development, access to and stewardship of antimicrobials, I don't know how you pronounce that word, and harmonization of surveillance. Now, when you say we shall do harmonization of surveillance and you don't tell us what that surveillance is, I think there's a legitimate concern there. But yes. I do think, I'll be honest, I think some of the concerns that have been some of the concerns about when I see people posting online that this is a plot to make money for big pharma, I just don't see the evidence for that in the treaty. But if you think it's there, it's there. And
I don't know if it's I don't know if I could go so far as to say it's some kind of a plot. It's not really. It's actually quite open. There's nothing. It's not a plot, or there's nothing conspiratorial about it. I mean, they're quite open about it in the pandemic treaty. So, I think it's kind of obvious. It's there for everyone to see. But there was some suggestion. They obviously can't agree on it anyway, and there was some suggestion that they were going to put forward some kind of a proposal, and it very worrying, I think, to a lot of people who were involved in this. They were going to put forward some kind of a proposal which didn't have which left open a lot of the areas, and what it was proposing was that they would set up these ongoing intergovernmental working groups in a lot of the areas, and they wanted people to sign up to this, but basically it would be like people signing a blank check because nobody knew how this was going to work out. But I think they've scrapped that now. But we'll see what happens. That's just an ongoing thing, and it's something that I just would like to keep my eye on. That's all I'll say, as I'm sure you would as well.
All right. Well, certainly from a news perspective, and I do think, as I say, I think there are real issues with the treaty when it comes to sort of, as you say, signing up to blank checks in relation to various of the articles. And I provided 2 examples there where I think there are certainly those issues. But let's move on to another issue, which is obviously immigration. It's the first thing you mentioned in your campaign launch video. It's a big issue for people. To some extent, though, I mean, I'm guessing that your views on this are largely similar to a lot of other candidates running in the election. But as a lawyer, I'm going to ask you, what legal steps can the government take to reduce the number of people coming here that they are not currently taking?
Oh, yeah, that's a very good question. Now, first of all, they can speed up deportation orders. They can ensure a more stringent application of decisions under the Dublin III regulations. They can ensure that the EU Asylum and Migration Pact is not passed. And the other solution, which I actually spoke about last night in Newtown and Kennedy, is the issue of joining with all the other EU members called on the Commission to consider the concept of a Rwanda-style processing system for asylum seekers. In fact, and you're very aware of this because I think Gript actually did an article on this recently. And I think that's an excellent idea because what's happening here, there's so many issues happening here. And as you're very aware, we have over 500 asylum seekers coming into the country every single week. We are just heading towards a serious crisis situation if nothing happens. I mean, 85% of those who are coming to our shores have no ID or no passport. And that's the other thing that's really, really important, is that this government must start utilising the Immigration Act of 2004 and have these people prosecuted. It's a strict liability offence. And of course, the significant advantage of doing that is that it will act as a deterrent. The problem is when all of these asylum seekers have come in, they're ringing back to their friends saying, yeah, no problem, made it through, didn't have an ID, got through. So what happens? All their friends come and they feel they're going to have the same lucky break. And I do feel it's a significant factor in the numbers that we have here. I mean, nobody else has these numbers. And of course, we all know that most of them are not coming from, this is not their first port of entry within the EU, which is, again, why the government must speed up the operation and the application of the Dublin III regulation, decisions, Immigration Act. Speed up the deportations. We must ensure that the EU Asylum and Migration Act is passed. And as I said, the fifth one then that I mentioned these in Newtown and Kennedy last night is the Rwanda-style system. I think that's a fantastic idea. It would mean that asylum seekers would then have to be processed in some safe third. Doesn't have to be a third world. I mean, some safe third country. I don't mean a third world country at all. It could be any kind of a country as long as it's safe. Well, as the standards applied are within utilising human rights norms and in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, and you see no reason why that could be. And then if that happens, it would mean then the government wouldn't, be getting into such trouble with so many communities in designating IPAS centres, which I'd be happy to talk to you about, because that is causing a major, major problem in Ireland, as I'm sure you know already.
Before we get into the IPAS centres, I want to ask you a question specific to not specific to you as a candidate, but specific to your background, which is, are the lawyers not a little bit to blame here? I mean, it seems to me if you look at the delays in the immigration system, and I'm not talking about you because I know you weren't involved in this. You were on the other side. You were involved in the tribunal. But are there not many of
Yeah.
your former colleagues down in the four courts or four gold mines, as the Phoenix magazine calls them, who have been making out like bandits for years with appeal after endless appeal after endless appeal, and some cases of individuals in the asylum system lasting 8 or 9 years, by which time they're eligible for citizenship? And is there not a case,
Yeah.
I mean, Alan Shatter, as you know, when he was Minister for Justice, tried to reform the justice system. Is there not a case for real substantive legal reform to be made to fix the immigration system in terms of that process?
This is, lawyers are doing what lawyers do best, and that's just it. And look, as you know, I mean, lawyers have legal and ethical obligations to do the very best for their client, and so in a sense, the system is there which facilitates that. If they exhaust all their remedies at the tribunal level, they've 2 shots at it. Then what they can do is they can take a judicial review, and that can often take a while. And then they can take, a judicial review of the deportation order, and then maybe circumstances change. And you say then the minister grants an amnesty, and because they're so long, then they can get citizenship. So there's so many different ways in which people can benefit from the system. And you see, what has happened is that because we are a country that applies all the human rights norms and qualifications, and in many ways that's a very good thing to ensure that that we operate with due process and everybody gets a fair hearing, and all of that is very important and laudable. And so I don't know personally how you could really limit that.
Is there not a case?
Every system.
Is there not a case? I mean, a couple of years ago,
every system should be.
Is it not the case? A couple of years ago, the government introduced what's called the Court of Appeal. The whole point of that was to sort of slimline the appeals course and take some of the stress off the High Court and the Supreme Court. Is there not a case, in your view, for a kind of a similar court specifically dealing at kind of High Court level, which is actually the first court that these cases go to in cases of appeals, that would streamline the process and speed it up a little bit rather than going through all the tiers?
And that's an interesting point that you made. And the Court of Appeal was indeed set up for that very reason. It was really to take the stress off the Supreme Court, in appeals from the High Court, that you would go to the Court of Appeal rather than jumping straight up to the Supreme Court, to enable them to deal with issues of, greater importance perhaps. But the problem is that in the system that's set up there, you have a 2-tier system in the tribunal. You have the International Protection Office system, where an adjudicator deals with the application at first instance. And then the second instance is where they come to somebody like me. I was one of many adjudicators on a panel, on a tribunal panel, who dealt with the appeals. So, and that really is the end of the line in terms of the process. There's no appeal from, let's say, from my decision. There's no appeal from a decision. If I made a decision in relation to an asylum seeker, they couldn't actually appeal it. That was the end of the line. Mm-hmm. The only thing they could do was to go to the High Court on a judicial review. And what's significant about a judicial review is that the case is not being heard on the merits again, because it's already been heard twice on the merits. So the only way in which they can, what they can do in the judicial review, is to say that the manner in which the adjudicator, i.e. me or somebody else, made the decision in accordance with fairness.
So it's a procedural appeal, is what you're saying.
Correct.
Okay. Look, I want to move on because we are limited on time, and I don't want to keep you all day because I know you're busy. Let's talk a little bit. The other thing you talk about in your a lot in the campaign is the Nature Restoration Act and the unfairness that you see towards farmers and other people in Ireland South. I think you live in County Kerry, obviously, which is a big farming community. My wife is from there.
Yes. Lovely.
Is there? I mean, don't the Greens, to play devil's advocate, have some kind of a point? I mean, I read an article the other day about the sheer collapse in the number of insects in Ireland that people will actually find on their roads. If somebody was driving 20 years ago, they will know in the summer that their windscreen used to be covered with dead insects. Now it hardly ever is. Is there not, something we can be doing to protect biodiversity and change that kind of situation that, is there not some way of working with farmers on that? Or are you just completely again?
Sure, of course. And like with everything else, John, there never should be absolutes in these situations, and it's all about consensus and working with people. And I totally get you on that. I'm all for biodiversity. I love nature myself. I really do. The issue that you pointed out about the insects, that has to do with the use of glyphosates and chemicals, and therein lies the problem. And, I think that needs to be reduced. That would be a very significant thing that the Greens could get involved in if they were genuinely concerned about the environment. I mean, glyphosates are carcinogenic. They're creating problems. They're in weed killers. People are using them on their lawns and their flowers, and they're getting sick, and they're ingesting this. And I know this from other aspects, but with regard to the nature restoration law, concern about that is that, very good peatland is being taken away from the farmers. I have a concern that that production is being reduced here. I think it's very important that we don't have that. I don't believe in this idea that man-made CO2 or animal-made CO2 is in any way having a detrimental impact on the environment.
Okay, well, that's a clear and bold statement.
Yes.
But
that's my view.
Yeah. In terms, though, of you say you don't want to see production reduced, which is fair. And for clarity, I want listeners to know I am asking these questions. They don't always represent my own views, but for the sake of challenging candidates and interviewing them, isn't there a case to be made? I mean, and I've put this to other candidates, I'm going to put it to you as well, that Europe is really disadvantaging. We talk about the migration crisis and people coming to Europe from the third world, but Europe is actively disadvantaging the third world in its agriculture and trade policies, because we're subsidizing the production of food here that is not economically sustainable for us to produce. I mean, the farming industry would collapse without the common agricultural policy. And at the same time, we're keeping out food produce that is being produced in South America and Africa and damaging those economies while rising the food costs in supermarkets for our own consumers. I mean, isn't there a case? I mean, those Greens who say or argue, and there aren't many of them, but some of them who say, look, Europe should move on from farming and let the third world feed us. Wouldn't that be better in some senses for migration policies?
I would have no problem with that at all. I'm all in favour of every country having the opportunity to develop itself as much as it wants. And of course, I think that would be ideal. I don't have a problem with that at all. But I just don't know if we need to be culling our herd so that we can take beef from Brazil, transport it across the ocean, creating more carbon, and end up having to eat beef, that's grown in very intensive conditions, where they're fed on pellets. I think our grass-fed beef we're renowned for it. I'm sure if you're a meat eater, you would want to be in a position where you could eat grass-fed beef rather than pellet-fed beef. And just generally the idea of taking the land from the farmers, it's just this idea of an encroachment, which I'm not really happy about as a general thing. It just makes me nervous, John. Do you know what I mean? It just makes me nervous.
Okay. Let's wrap up with questions on foreign policy, because foreign policy is actually a really important issue for MEPs. You've actually got a much bigger voice in the European Parliament, and people will listen to the European Parliament perhaps more than they would to the Irish National Parliament, because it's a much bigger body and represents a whole lot more people. So, but I want to tie it back to a domestic issue, which is obviously this issue of Irish neutrality. Dublin is now one of the most economically vital sort of nerve centres for the whole European Union, especially since Brexit, since a lot of companies moved to Dublin in the financial services sector and elsewhere. Aren't we a little bit naive in Ireland to believe that in the event of the outbreak of a general war, both Dublin and our undersea cables, which serve a whole lot of Europe, wouldn't be a target? And aren't we a little bit naive in imagining that we can survive with a tiny little army and saying we're just not going to get involved in anything? Or is neutrality sustainable in your view?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mean, unfortunately, we have been poking the bear, as you know, and there was a recent development in the EU where funds frozen by the EU as part of a sanctions policy for Russia were basically raided. And I know that the the Russian ambassador made a statement on this issue recently, and they were very unhappy about it. And he more or less suggested that, there may be, and I'm thinking, why are we doing this? It doesn't make sense. And why are we getting involved in another conflict that's not of our doing? I just think this is, it's a war really it's a proxy war between the United States. We all know that. And, if our government were smart and wise and were looking out for our interests, they wouldn't be involved in any process that potentially puts our people at risk. And I certainly don't approve of anything that they're doing that would upset the Russians. I don't think this is a smart move, and I would have concerns about that.
Well, that probably answers my next question, which was, how are you going to vote on military aid for Ukraine if that comes up again in the European Parliament? I think we can probably skip that one based on your answer.
I will definitely not be voting for military aid for Ukraine. Absolutely, definitely not. I can tell you that.
Well, then let's talk about the other conflict that's going on at the moment, which is obviously the conflict in Gaza. That's the other big foreign policy issue that the European Union is facing. Are you of the view of some of your colleagues and other candidates that the European Union should review its trade links with Israel? Or would that be a mistake? Would that not be poke? You say we shouldn't poke the Russian bear. Would that kind of thing not amount to poking the American bear? Or the American moose? I don't know what the eagle, I think they call themselves.
Yeah, the American eagle. Yeah. I don't think I'd be too concerned about poking the American eagle, given the way it's behaving at the moment. So I don't know if, sort of sanctions on food coming from Israel I don't think it's going to make that much difference at the end of the day. There are bigger issues at stake here. It's a very complicated, complex, protracted situation. I've been there myself. I've seen how the Palestinians have been treated. It's very difficult. And I do feel that, outside interests have got involved in that conflict to fuel it on both sides in a way that's absolutely not helpful. I mean, we have to have some class of a two-state solution. There's no doubt about that. The offensive has to stop. It's barbaric. It's inhumane. What's happening to the people of Gaza, already living in horrendous conditions, living in an open-air prison. And these people are so disadvantaged on so many levels. It's beyond horrific. But I don't think for one second that any of this is coming from the ordinary people who live in Israel or anything like that. So it's just one of those very difficult conflicts where I feel that the energy and the dissatisfaction is being sort of used and abused by other interests to keep the conflagration going. And I'm sure you would agree with that yourself. So what's needed is more, it's more work on a diplomatic level to try and resolve the disputes. Not an easy thing. People have been doing it for years and they haven't got anywhere. So I don't have a magic bullet for this. I don't think anybody does, but we've got to keep working to help those who need help and to, really, and I think the regime that's there, the Benjamin Netanyahu regime, is not a healthy regime. They're the ones that are poking the bear of Hamas and Palestine. This is a leader who is despised by his own people. And it's a miracle that he's still even there in a position of power.
I'm not sure that's correct. I mean, opinion polls do show 58% support for the war in Israel. So I'm not sure that just on a factual matter that it's fair to say.
Well, maybe we're reading different opinion polls. That's fine, and we can agree to differ on that. But in any event, look, with the new regime, we might have a different situation there. But I think everybody, it's behoves everybody, every country, every government, every diplomat in the world to work as hard as they can to do everything they can to resolve this dispute.
All right. We've gone to about 40 minutes, which is about as long as we normally go in these things. But I'm going to ask you, is there anything that you wanted to talk about or any policy issue that you wanted to raise that we haven't discussed?
No, not really. The only thing is that obviously you would know that I'm a free speech advocate. I've done a number of videos on this. I'm concerned about the the national legislation in particular. But thankfully that's been stalled for the moment. So we hopefully that won't happen. It won't become enacted, but we'll have to wait and see. And then it will be interesting to monitor the Digital Services Act and to see how that plays out as well. So I'll be happy to keep an eye on that when I get to Europe. And finally, of course, to you and all of your listeners and all of your subscribers, to remember me on June the 7th. And if you want me to continue to fight for you in Europe, vote Una McGuirk #1 on June the 7th if you live in Ireland South. And thank you very much in anticipation.
All right. Well, I'm obliged to mention that there are 23 candidates on the ballot in Ireland South. We've heard from a few of them on this series. I know, by the way, there will be some listeners who say, you didn't interview my guy, you didn't interview this guy. I can't interview everybody. There simply wouldn't be the time of day. There are 73 candidates. There are substantially fewer than 73 days in the election campaign. It simply wouldn't have been possible. I'm delighted we got to talk to Una, and as we got to talk to other candidates in that election. And I'll say to Una what I say to every candidate who comes on here, which is that thank you, Una, for taking the step into public service of putting yourself on the ballot paper, because win, lose or draw, we wouldn't have a democracy without people willing to stand up and make their views known. You can vote from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. this Friday. If you're waiting for the results, they won't actually come until Sunday. The local elections will be counted first on Saturday. Then the European election count will begin on Sunday. So that'll be a long and interesting day. And Una, I think the count in Ireland South is probably likely to stretch into Monday and possibly even Tuesday, because there are so many candidates.
Yes,
and there will be so many
indeed.
counts to go through. So that is it from me and Una. I'll be back with one more of these with one more candidate to be interviewed before we go polling on Friday. But until then, thanks so much for listening, and remember to cast your vote. Take care.
Thank you.